So please welcome Peter Hitchens.
Thank you very much. I'm not proposing to subject you to a long Fidel Castro-style harangue, but much a fairly brief introduction of what I intend to convey, and then to take as many questions and challenges as possible. If you'll forgive me for that approach, it seems to me to be fairer to you as well as being kinder to me. But I'll begin with a story from Soviet Moscow. Think yourself back to the days of Leonid Brezhnev, to the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB, Komitet Государственной Безопасности. And it is coming up towards the Festival of the New Year, and it is the end of the KGB basic training scheme, and several candidates are taking their final test before they can be admitted to the job of agent. And the final test is this: they've done the Marxism-Leninism, they've done the dialectical materialism, all that is behind them. The final test is this: it's the middle of winter in Moscow. They are told to go out and catch a rabbit. So off they go, 15 of them, into the snowy wastes of Moscow to try and find a rabbit. The hours pass. One by one, they trickle back into the Lubyanka, into the training room. No rabbit. Finally, there are two left who have not returned. One is called Volodya, and the other is called Kostya. And they come in together, and they're clutching a bag, which is moving slightly, and they put it on the table, and the instructor says, "Comrades, have you found a rabbit?" And they say, "Comrade instructor, we have found a rabbit." And the instructor says, "Right, let's see it." So they open the bag and tip it up, and onto the table tumbles a very bad-tempered and disgruntled-looking pussycat. And the instructor says, "Comrades, this is not a rabbit, this is pussycat." And they say, "That's what it said, comrade instructor, but after we questioned it for some time, it's admitted to being a rabbit." Now this illustrates to me, more or less, the mental process by which people are approaching the Russian problem at the moment. It's a pussycat, but they want to believe that it is a rabbit, so they interrogate it incessantly and bombard it with distortions, misunderstandings, some deliberate, some accidental, some of them the result of plain ignorance, and they come to the conclusion that Russia is something quite different from what it is, because that is what they want to believe, just as Kostya, and indeed Volodya, who may well still be working for the committee in some form or other, wanted very much to believe it, and as their instructor wanted them to believe it. They, by the way, they got the job. The others didn't, because they understood very well the purpose of distorting the truth, which was behind the Soviet experiment, and which is very much behind what's going on at the moment. A very, very strongly based desire to believe that something isn't true, that something is true which isn't. And where does this come from, and why is it so important? Now, I'm not a Russianist. Unlike my friend Bridget Kendall, who now sits grandly as master of Peterhouse just up the road, I don't speak Russian. I can bluster in it. I had 3 months tuition. I am not steeped and versed in Russian history or literature. I am somebody who at very short notice found myself dispatched to Moscow during the final years of the Soviet period, and during that time went through several intellectual and personal convulsions which taught me a great deal about the history of Russia and of the Soviet Union, which still very much influenced the way that I think. And what I did learn above all was that Russia and the Soviet Union were two different places. And I'm still amazed that some experiences which I had towards the end of my time in Moscow don't seem to have affected many of the people who were either there at the time, or who knew people who were there at the time, or who ought to be charged with reporting this sort of thing to the world. The first was, on the day of the putsch itself, I was in Moscow, and luckily enough, this just shows that grand journalism doesn't work. I was working at the time for one of the worst newspapers in the world. I didn't know anything very much. I didn't speak Russian, yet I was there on the day of the putsch. The New York Times, the Guardian, the Times, Le Monde, the Neue Zeitung, they were all on holiday. I was there. Tanks came up my street, and I watched as Moscow came under the influence of this extraordinary moment of historical madness, where a group of people, some of them drunks, some of them ineffectual no-hopers, some of them serious KGB operatives, such as Khrushchev and Puga, had actually staged a coup in the center of a major city against probably the one of the most globally popular figures in the world, Mikhail Gorbachev. And I watched it collapse. And the moment came and it was clear that it had collapsed, and the tanks which had come up my street on the Monday morning had trundled away back to wherever they'd come from. An amazing thing happened. I remember wandering around Moscow as it became clear that the putsch had failed and seeing every single litter bin in the city full of Communist Party cards, red and gold, burning. Again and again. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of bins, hundreds of thousands of cards. It was a moment of complete realization for so many people who had understood at that moment that it was no longer necessary to pay any further court to Marxism-Leninism for career advancement, to get your child into a good school or a good university, to get a decent flat, anything. None of the forces which had previously compelled people to bow down to this false god were there anymore, and so the instant reaction, throw this card, this symbol of mental oppression, into the bin. A few weeks later, by huge good fortune, I got permission to go into what was then the closed city of Sevastopol, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet of the Soviet Navy, one of the places where Admiral Sergei Gorshkov had begun to build up his global naval challenge to the United States, a real attempt to turn the Soviet Union into an actual conventional challenger to the United States on the high seas of the world. What did I find? Every creek inlet in Sevastopol full of scuttled ships. Some down by the bow, some down by the stern, some turned turtle, but all dead, gone, finished forever. It was over. Two things were over. Marxism-Leninism was over. The challenge to the United States for world power was over. One was discredited, the other they could no longer afford. Physical evidence that these things were gone stayed with me for the rest of my life. And I was astonished when, some years after having left what had by then become the Russian Federation, I began increasingly to hear people saying that there was a Russian threat, that there was a new Cold War, that we were facing suddenly a genuine danger of repression from, of not so much repression, but of external menace from the Moscow government. And I was puzzled by this partly because it was coupled with ceaseless correct statements that the government of Vladimir Putin was repressive, which it undoubtedly is. I mean, I stand here and I will say again, as I've said many times, Vladimir Putin is beyond doubt a sinister tyrant. His behavior domestically is inexcusable, and whether or not you attribute various actions to him which have been claimed to be his, it is absolutely certain that the Russian government has a direct role in the Magnitsky episode, in which the treatment of Magnitsky itself is completely indefensible. There are many other aspects of this I've written about, in the way in which Mr. Putin got control of broadcasting, for instance, where I've talked in detail to people who were involved in that, where it's evident that you are not dealing here with a man who loves freedom. So get that out of the way to begin with. But then remember, as one also considers the brutality of the Russian state's war in Chechnya, for instance, remember that under Boris Yeltsin, the very parliament of the Russian Federation was shelled by tanks on the orders of Boris Yeltsin. And that his war in Chechnya was, if anything, even more savage and brutal than that conducted by the Putin state. And yet, nobody cared. And it seemed to me that there was something wrong about this, that if we were really genuinely concerned about repression and misbehavior and savage war-making by the Russian Federation, or indeed about the lack of democracy, then why did we only discover it when Russia had a leader who was concerned about defending its interests abroad? And then I was told repeatedly that Russia was an expansionist state. And I did some basic mathematics, and I've done a long blog posting on this, which you can read, which demonstrates that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow has abandoned, without a fight, control over 700,000 square miles in Europe alone. This is not counting the huge areas over which it has abandoned control in Central Asia, which is a separate issue in some ways, but they are likewise huge. And as I say, without a fight, without any attempt to regain, without any particular struggle. This does not seem to me to be an expansionist power. And then we are told repeatedly, well, what about the seizure of Crimea? And again, I did some serious investigation of the story of Crimea. And again, I can recommend you to my lengthy blog post, a brief, or rather not so brief, history of Crimea, because it is rather long. I constructed this by getting a friend to get from various archives the reports of the period, which are not on the internet, from the Associated Press and from BBC monitoring of what was going on there. And what emerges is that in the months after the independence of Ukraine, which was quite rightly gained through a referendum and granted without any attempt at obstruction by the Moscow government, the inheritor of the Soviet Union. The people of Crimea actually, following the new Ukrainian constitution, obtained enough signatures for a petition to allow them to hold a referendum on the future of Crimea. And they were about to do so when they were threatened, more or less openly, with violence by the Kiev government to prevent it from doing so. And so no such referendum ever took place. Ukraine was quite happy to leave Moscow's control by a referendum, and it was quite happy to take advantage of Russia's willingness to say, yes, we're prepared to accept this, even though it cannot have been welcome news in Moscow to lose control over Ukraine, but nonetheless, no effort was made to prevent it. But Ukraine would not apply the rules which had liberated itself to its own territory, even though there was beyond doubt a strong and, I think, almost certainly majority feeling for Crimea to leave Ukraine at that stage. So this simple fact seems to me to illustrate an important point, that the rules for some countries at the end of the Soviet era were quite different from the rules from others, and that generally they operated to the disadvantage of anybody with Russian nationality at the end of that stage. Not known by most people, but known by me, knowable to you, and reported by me, and available. And then I began to look into what had actually happened in Ukraine. I hugely recommend, by the way, Frontline Ukraine, an excellent work by Professor Richard Sacco. If any of you haven't read it, then you should, because it goes into great detail about what happened. You can also look into a certain amount of research, which I did, into the huge expenditures of money by the European Union on what were called civil society organizations in the years before 2014 in Ukraine, obviously designed openly designed to obtain influence. What we cannot discuss here is the covert methods used to obtain influence in Ukraine by people, because they are necessarily covert. It is interesting that Mr. Brennan, the then head of the CIA, was discovered in Kiev pretty much in the midst of these events, and presumably was not on holiday or sampling the food while he was there. But the important point is this, that the aggression which took place was not an aggression by tanks or by ships or by aeroplanes. It was the aggression most commonly used by Western countries in the modern era. The aggression which was used in Iran in 1953 with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, and was used in Guatemala with the overthrow of President Arbenz, and which of course was also attempted to be used in many other places in Latin America by the United States. Those are the two principal instances of it. And this form of aggression is not, of course, covered by international law, but when you have a mob, which it was in the centre of Kiev, and when you have that mob given the visible, open and personal support of Catherine Ashton, High Representative for Foreign Policy for the European Union, Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State in Washington, Guido Westerwelle, until very recently the Foreign Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, and of course Senator John McCain, amongst others, openly supporting a mob which in the end killed large numbers of policemen, and these are United Nations figures, which I said, then it seems to me that you are dealing with an aggression. And it seems to me that you have to recognize that this is so, especially when the legitimate president of Ukraine, whatever you think of Ukraine's constitution or indeed its politics, the legitimate president of Ukraine, by its own rules, was overthrown, driven from office by a violent putsch in which armed men were seen in the Ukrainian Rada during this event, and was then removed by procedures which did not accord with Ukraine's own constitution for presidential impeachment. This is a putsch. And it's a putsch with foreign backing. And it is an aggressive action. And the Russian action in Crimea, whether you wish to defend it or not, seems to me to be undoubtedly, in reality, a response to an aggression rather than an aggression. And a very, very limited one, limited partly by the fact that under the Kharkov Treaty, Russian troops were already legally stationed there and were able to act, and also partly because I think Mr. Putin was very anxious not to take any further steps that would have put him in a more awkward position, and also semi-ratified by the fact that even though I have no doubt that the referendum held in Crimea was rigged and under the most appalling conditions, I don't think anybody seriously doubts that if it had been held under the most rigorously controlled conditions and been held by the United Nations, the result would have been any different. So we have here a very complicated situation, one in which most of what people believe and most of what people tell is untrue. And at the same time, ceaseless allegations that as a result of this we need to fear Russian aggression. And now I have to go back a very long way, and I would again recommend very strongly a book, which if you haven't read, you should read it, called Who Lost Russia by Peter Conradi, who's now the foreign editor of the Sunday Times. It contains several extremely important details which have not previously been shown, including much more detail about the promises originally made to Western political figures, by Western political figures to Mikhail Gorbachev and others about the expansion of NATO. But it also contains links to extraordinary investigations by the New York Times during the Clinton era, which uncovered the huge amounts of money which were being spent by lobbyists from the arms industry to push for NATO expansion under the Clinton presidency. And they also reveal the actions of George Kennan, the originator of the Cold War, who had, at the very beginning, by his famous memorandum calling for the Soviet Union to be contained, begun pretty much the whole policy of anti-Soviet action by the United States, who came out of retirement at the age of 93, still completely compos mentis, and with absolutely no material reason to do so, to condemn these calls to NATO expansion, saying it was a catastrophic policy and an insult to those in Russia who had overthrown a terrible tyranny and who needed, above all, the support and encouragement of Western nations rather than an attempt to depict them as new aggressors. These things are facts. The origin of NATO expansion comes, it's almost like an Eric Ambler thriller of the 1930s, and the crudest old-fashioned communist propaganda in which arms manufacturers buy a government's policy which suits them and produces more orders for their weapons, which they're afraid of losing. But it does seem to me to be extraordinarily indicative of the origin and basis of this policy. And examine, as you must, the finances and affiliations of many of the think tanks whose members are extremely active in the new Cold War frenzy, and you will find the names such as Raytheon and Bell Helicopters and so forth in their lists of sponsors and contributors. The cruelty of it is so astonishing that it makes me blanch. I really can't believe that people actually do things as crude as that. It makes me wonder whether I made a mistake when I stopped being a Marxist-Leninist in 1975. Maybe it really is like that after all, but honestly it's true. And it's a crude lobby, and it has one other factor to it, which is important and one of the reasons why it is so successful. Some of you may remember, and some of you may have heard of an interesting man called Gennady Gerasimov. I don't even know if he's still among us, but he was for some time Mikhail Gorbachev's very silky spokesman during the main period of perestroika. He ceased to be his spokesman after he was asked at a foreign ministry briefing about rumors that Mikhail Gorbachev was going to get a Nobel Prize. And somebody said, Gennady, what's Mikhail Gorbachev going to get a Nobel Prize for? And Gerasimov said, well, it's certainly not for economics. And shortly after, he was made ambassador to Portugal. But before this, he'd been confronted with a group of very skeptical, reasonably skeptical Western journalists. I might have been among them, but I wasn't, who weren't entirely convinced Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost were real, who thought they might be a front for an attempt to gull us into quiescence and fool us into believing that the Soviet Union had become peaceful when it hadn't. And Gerasimov said, gentlemen, I'm so sorry. We have done the cruelest thing to you that anybody could possibly do. We have deprived you of an enemy. Warmed and comforted by the idea that there is an enemy over there whom we are all united in opposing, who we can keep from our door by unity and indeed by buying missiles and tanks. And that enemy is so bad that the idea that it might conceivably not be as bad as we think it is a bit like discovering that after reading The Lord of the Rings, that the Dark Lord Sauron is actually quite a nice person. People don't want to know. They would much prefer a world in which the enemy was in plain view, obvious, clear, easily described, easily depicted, and of course they look at a land where they use a funny alphabet, and where it snows a lot, and where there are bears, and it fits the bill so perfectly that is why so many people long all the time to believe that Russia is the enemy and that the cat is a rabbit At that point, I will hand over to you and take your questions. Thank you. If there are any. Yes.
So I'm interested in what seems to be quite an objective overview on your view on, you mentioned the referendum and the rigging of that. Could you sort of specify why you came to that view and why you don't think that just the boycotts of the referendum sort of account for that really extreme result?
I just assume that anything which the Russian state does, which involves votes, is crooked. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. It has been so pretty much since the beginning. I think the only fair election ever held in Russia was the one for the Constituent Assembly in 1917. Certainly the elections in the Yeltsin period were appallingly bought and rigged, and I see no reason to believe otherwise. I think it's a sensible default position to take. I'm not going to make my point by trying to defend the indefensible or being afraid of the truth. I think it's very likely that if the conduct of that referendum ever were independently investigated, it would be found to be disreputable, and I just don't think that there's any point in my trying to stand here and say, well, actually they were very nice and they did a perfect job. It's unlikely to be true. No one will believe me. And the fact is, it's not the point. The point is that even if it had been perfectly conducted by the members of the United Nations Security Council patrolling it, it would have had the same result. It would have had the same result because that is what the people of Crimea want. And if we believe, as we're supposed to, in the self-determination of peoples, then that would seem to lead to only one conclusion. Anyone else? Yes.
Where do you see the future of this? In terms of it, just I tend to agree with a lot of what you said, but as you say, it's almost deflating in terms of trying to counter it in any shape or form. But there must be. What do you think is the next logical step in terms of the West's view of Russia? I mean, sanctions now emerge from very specific reasons now into, against Gazprom to destroy essentially their GDP, because 5% of the GDP is from Gazprom. So it just seems to roll on and on. I don't see any end to it.
Sanctions are often the making of the nations to which they're applied, of course, but they're full of unintended consequences, but I wouldn't like to speculate on that. And there is another element in this, which is, of course, the real European problem, which is the European Union, is the continuation of Germany by other means. And the fundamental conflict on the European continent has been really, since the end of the 19th century, a conflict between German and Russian interests, which is now, of course, heavily influenced by the fact that the United States, having failed at Versailles, has since 1945 increasingly viewed, and especially since 1989, viewed Germany and the European Union as pivotal ways in which to maintain what they regard as stability in Europe. And then we have the other crucial point, which is the European Union cannot conceivably ever include Russia, because the European Union is so fundamentally based on German hegemony, and if Russia entered it, then that would be unbalanced totally and irreversibly. So everybody in truth knows that whatever expansion the European Union makes in any direction, it's far more likely to absorb Nigeria as a member than it ever is to invite Russia to join. And it's not going to happen, so the conflict remains. The only way in which it would ever absorb Russia would be as absorbing Yugoslavia, that is to say piecemeal, and break it up. So a breakup of Russia, or a reduction of Russia to insignificance, which is of course what Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about in his book The Grand Chessboard, where he pointed out that the control of Ukraine is absolutely crucial to the standing and power and wealth of Russia, and if it loses control of Ukraine, which has been the policy, of course, of the German-speaking nations since about 1880, then Russia is on the way to extinction. Then you have the other huge Russian problems, which nobody talks about because they don't know geography or they're not interested. The Chinese problem, where in the Far East, it's quite possible, it seems to me, that China will remove many of the Russian territories from Russian control simply by populating them. because they are unpopulated or hardly populated by Russians at the moment, and this is a chosen method of the People's Republic of China, very visible, for instance, in Tibet and Urumqi, where Han Chinese simply appear in large numbers and have actually become the majority. Who knows what the future of that is, but it seems to me that there is a major tension there for Russia, and Russia's economy doesn't have much prospect for growth. And much of it is reliant on China, which I don't think has any particular reason to allow Russia to get much more powerful than it is. So it's all pretty bad. And then you have the other point, which is that when you have, and say what you like about Vladimir Putin, when you have a leader as strong and effective as that, generally his existence kills off the possibility of a succession. But he must leave. Sooner or later he will not be there anymore, and at that point I think Russia faces a severe problem, as it has so often before when it's had strong leaders who've gone. So the prognosis is all bad. The only one thing, one piece of good news is that I think one of the reasons for a lot of the recent really high tension has been the complete obeisance of France, the United States and Britain to Saudi Arabia, and the policy in Syria which they pursued as a result of that, which has now been negated actually by Russian action. And it was their fury over Russia's opposition to that, which I think may well have led to the pursuit of the association agreement with Ukraine. I think they may have decided that since Russia was getting in the way of their most treasured policy, they would respond by getting in the way of Russia's most treasured policy. And that may well be it. That, of course, is now winding down. But whether something else will replace it, I don't know. Yes.
Hiya. I just wondered what your opinion was on the leadership challenges to Putin in the upcoming elections, especially the daughter of his former mentor who's running, and she's featured quite a lot in the Western media recently.
I don't. The last Russian election where there were, well, there has not been since Mr. Putin came to office a serious Russian presidential election. I think the Kremlin would be glad to have there was Mrs. Kakamada, wasn't there, a few years ago, a relatively serious opponent who can be defeated without any great difficulty, but I don't think that any candidate would be permitted to stand who had any serious chance of winning. I myself am surprised that they don't allow Alexei Navalny to stand, because I think the support for him outside Moscow and St. Petersburg is very small, and I don't think that he would actually be much of a challenge, but there you are. It's not for me to think into their minds, but I do not think that as long as Mr. Putin is in charge there will be any sort of fair election in Russia, and I'm not at all sure there'll be one afterwards either.
The media has shown this as an inside job with the daughter, I forget her name, but the daughter of his former mentor. I
forget her name as well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Which is more shameful in my case. But anyway, yeah, I don't think I don't think that there is a serious challenge. And if there were, it would not be allowed to take place. Yes.
I have understood the first question as asking what are your reasons for believing that had the Crimea referendum been properly administered, there would be no significant difference in the result. Is that right?
Well, no, I was saying, not about the result, but just whether boycotting could account, rather than rigging, could have accounted for the high margin.
I have no idea, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that rigging took place. I can't. I think there is some suggestion there had been. I'd have to look it up. I just think to sit here and say, oh no, the Putin government would never rig an election, it would be a laughable thing to do, and I wouldn't do it. Yes.
Just a remark, I would say the Presidential Council for Human Rights of the Russian Federation actually put out a report about this referendum saying that there was a 30% turnout approximately, of which 51% voted for independence of Crimea. So that is quite far removed from the 94% that the official results display.
Sure. Surprised me. But I just know if Crimea is is populated mainly by Russians, and they don't. And Ukraine is not. From my own visit there some time ago now. Ukrainian rule there was not popular. In fact, it was strongly disliked.
I think there was
It was also incompetent, and if people go on quite rightly about how Russia is corrupt and badly managed, my goodness, by comparison with Ukraine, it's like Switzerland. Ukraine is such a mess in terms of government. It's so much more corrupt and incompetent than Russia. It's astonishing. You wouldn't think it could be done, but they've done it, and people didn't particularly like it. Yeah.
In the West, we've made believe that Vladimir Putin is extremely, extremely popular. So, how popular do you think he actually is in Russia?
I think that there are a lot of Russians who are resigned to him as the best available, who saw him as the man and still see him as the man who paid their pensions, which is very important, and the man who restored both order and a certain amount of national respect. I've always thought the best endorsement of Putin I ever heard came from a man called Stanislav Gavrilyuk, who was a great friend of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and who made two brilliant films, which some of you may have seen, but as far as I know, have never been shown properly in the West. The first, Tak Žít Nельзя, which means roughly, we can't go on living like this, which I saw in Moscow in the summer of 1990, with my interpreter sitting next to me, whispering into my ear what was going on in the Cosmos cinema. And this film was about the reality of life in the Soviet Union, the squalor and filth and dishonesty of it. And it was the first such film that had ever been made. And what I noticed as I sat listening to the whisper of my translator in my ear and watching the screen was that everybody else in the cinema was weeping, because it was the first time they'd ever seen the real lives which they lived honestly portrayed in major media in their country, and it was quite an experience for them. And he then made a second film of the same sort called Russia Которую мы потеряли, the Russia we have lost, which produced some wonderful archive film and stills completely undermining the Bolshevik propaganda about the nature of pre-revolutionary Russia, and also showing the embarrassingly decrepit and gaga state into which Lenin had fallen before he died, which again had been suppressed during the entire Soviet period. And Gavrilyuk, during the last election, which was 2013, said that he was going to support Putin because he had returned the country to normal corruption. And I think this was not an uncommon view. People were not expecting all that much. They had been through so much. And I remember when, in the final months of my time in Moscow, it was very much like the opening scenes of The Third Man, which some of you will remember. The Russian, or the Moscow middle classes, were standing on the streets with little Soviet tables, selling their most treasured possessions to try and raise money for food. And that's what had happened to them. The currency of their bank accounts had been rendered valueless. Their jobs had gone. The currency had become trash. And that's what they were reduced to. And I've always remembered it because I've always thought it might happen to us. But it happened to them. And you probably know, again, that the reputation under Yeltsin of the democratic state was such that the Russian for democracy is obviously demokratia, but many Russians refer to it as demokratia, which again some of you will know means approximately the rule of excrement. And the discrediting of the Western democratic idea under Yeltsin was very considerable. And this is among reasonable people. And I have spoken to people who are hard-working, middle-class people trying to make a living who feel that way about Vladimir Putin. They don't regard him as some kind of idol. It's not a revival of the Stalin cult or anything of that kind. But they recognize with a shrug that this is so. And yet you go and see, I went again during the same election to visit a charming, a very beautiful Moscow liberal in her apartment in the west of the city. And she was speaking of how much she wanted there to be an alternative to Putin, but she admitted that there was no alternative, that the Russian liberals had nobody who they could put against it, and that there really wasn't anywhere to turn. It was also very noticeable that her front door was made of a plate of armoured steel about 1.5 inches thick, which might have come from a warship, which seemed to suggest that also she wasn't terribly confident about the level of order and crime prevention in the city. And those steel front doors were quite common when I was there in the Soviet era as well. Moscow is secretly, if you're a Russian, a very violent city and can be a very dangerous one. And it still is. But I don't think that it's a place where liberal democracy is likely to flourish anytime soon. And I also think that, like any proud people who have been through many, many catastrophes and who highly value their culture and their nationality, they grieve to see the way in which it was dragged through the mud in the Yeltsin era, and they're pleased to see that they're, to some extent, respected and feared again. And that's a natural response of normal people, and it's one of the reasons why people vote for him. But it's not. There's no cult of Putin. It's not an enthusiasm. It's a reluctant recognition that this is where they've got to, and this is the best that they're likely to get. Yes, please.
Speaking of normal corruption, how would you characterise Putin's relationship with the oligarchs and how it's developed since the Yeltsin era?
I can't know, because everything that one reads is rumour. It seems to me to be reasonable to assume, since Putin was very much part of the Yeltsin circle, that his relationship with them can be reasonably assumed to have had elements of corruption. On the other hand, he's made it clear to them that he will not brook any political challenge. And I think that was what the Khodorkovsky episode was about. He recognises that he's surrounded by people who are rich and potentially powerful. Whatever he may do to get on the right side of them, he does. And as I say, it's unlikely that anyone's going to expose it for obvious reasons. But as soon as any of them show any signs of using their wealth to create an effective opposition to him, then he will attack them with complete ruthlessness and mercilessness, which is what he did to Khodorkovsky. And I think it's as it appears to be. But on the whole business about corruption is of course, in a society which isn't wholly free, descends very rapidly into ruin. The interesting thing is that people get very exercised about it in Putin's case, whereas there is an almost complete parallel to Putin's career in the career of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. And the parallels are astonishing. The only difference being that Erdogan puts many, many more journalists in prison than Putin would ever dream of doing. And it's much, much more dangerous to be an opponent simply in conversation or in academic life of Erdogan than it is to be an opponent of Putin. But otherwise, the parallels are considerable. And the West's outrage at Erdogan's very, very rapid destruction of liberty and democracy in Turkey is almost non-existent. So I always believe that if you object to something on principle, you object to it everywhere. And if we object to as a country and in foreign policy, to the behaviour, the internal behaviour of the Russian government, then we really would have to object to the similar policy of the Turkish government, but we do not. There's even another parallel, which is the seizure of North Cyprus by Turkey in 1974, on very similar pretext to the seizure of Crimea by Russia in 2014. Although it's officially condemned, a member of NATO ever since. Yes, please.
Why do you think Russia is put forward as this great bogeyman, yet China seems just to be ignored?
Well, again, I think it's because it's easy. In fact, the problem with China is that it's so rich and so powerful, and we are so indebted to China, I think, especially since the Clinton years. The economic relationship between the United States and China is, I think, very subservient, and I suspect ours is too. And I just think that one of the things which politicians who want to appear to be strong and effective in national defence like to do is to pick on someone more or less their own size, and it very much helps if they pick on someone who's their own size or smaller than them, who looks bigger. And in most people's minds, Russia, because it's very large on the map and because they remember the Soviet era, looks very big. And so when we see that the poor old Admiral Kuznetsov staggering and lunging its way down the North Sea and through the Channel, pouring out smoke and dropping bits off the side and its aeroplanes falling into the sea, we were supposed to believe that this was a huge military threat. And it was amazing how many Western journalists, particularly British ones, believed that it was, because they still have it in their heads that the great Soviet threat still exists. But I think it is partly a function of politicians who wish to appear strong and who therefore find it very convenient to play on this illusion. When you tell, one of the most effective arguments against people who say that Russia is a threat is to point out that its GDP is roughly the size of Italy's, and that the combined GDPs of NATO members are at least 10 times as great, and that also NATO has far greater military forces. But these facts are very inconvenient to people like, well, I was going to say Michael Fallon, because he made a big business out of flaring up the Russia threat when he was Secretary of State for Defence, but it now falls to that man whose name I can't remember, who's taken over from him, Gavin something, to do the same, and he will doubtless do the same. It's because people are ignorant. It's because people have these images in their heads, and because we simply don't have any modern memory of China as a major military, economic, or diplomatic threat. Though it is very interesting going through the behaviour of British governments on willingness to meet the Dalai Lama and on maintaining policies, maintaining particularly objections to the Chinese takeover of Tibet, which was quietly dropped a few years ago to the fury, by the way, of the Indian government. It's very interesting if you chart these things. You see that, in fact, increasingly the British government does grovel to China at every opportunity it can get. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Yeah, so I would just like to ask about the effect of the image of Putin himself in the West, because I'm not sure if you saw these documentaries. If you have, it doesn't matter. Then move on to the next question. But
I didn't see them. A lot of people urged me to see them, but you mean
the Olive Stone?
Yeah, I was urged to. I simply don't have time to watch this stuff.
Okay,
so
well,
I'm aware of it. I'm aware of it.
Just some of
it sounded a bit.
Impression.
Yeah.
They were on in June, and basically, I thought it offered an unprecedented insight into the man himself, as well in terms of his private life, and also gave him.
I doubt it.
Well. It offered, I mean, in terms of what was said about, for example, his palaces, certain relationships with his family members. Obviously, he didn't reveal everything. But and then that was given a platform on Sky Atlantic, so in Western media, but not necessarily the mainstream media. And in that, he explained some of the issues he held with NATO expansion, which you mentioned, but also some of the American provocations. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think the image of Putin that was created by those documentaries has affected our position on Russia.
I can't answer that because I haven't seen it. Not very much, I think, because most people won't have seen it. What is interesting is the rather confusing sort of quadrille which some social conservatives in Western countries have been dancing with the Russian government. They see a social conservatism in Russia, which they find quite appealing, forgetting as they do so that it comes hand in hand with, as I say, a rather nasty despotism, and that has appealed to people such as Nigel Farage and I think Marine Le Pen as well to some extent, which would seem to be a warning for most intelligent people not to get that close. It is very hard, if you are a social conservative, as I am, to find any country these days in which social conservatism gets any kind of chance. So that there's a tendency to grasp at any straw that happens to be floating, but I wouldn't do that. And there are people who have always been people who quite rightly are sceptical of the of the claims, the propaganda of the United States and of other Western powers, and who point out their hypocrisy, who then make the great mistake of then falling over the line into support and endorsement of other powers, which are in their own way just as bad. I think the only intelligent approach to any government, by anybody of independent mind, particularly for journalists, which I am myself, is always to remain sceptical, never to become a servant or a propagandist of any kind of power. It's simply unwise, just because George W. Bush or David Cameron or Angela Merkel or the ridiculous Trump person is as reprehensible as they undoubtedly are, and just because they do stupid things, don't then fall into the arms of Vladimir Putin or the Iranian Ayatollahs because they are the apparent opposition. Stay independent wherever you are. The fact that they're nasty doesn't make him nice. The fact that they're incompetent and liberal doesn't make him any kind of example to follow. It's Russia's misfortune to be in this position. Here, I tend to tell this story too much, but it seems to me to be true. People often say things about other people's languages which are wrong, and George W. Bush was famously said to have claimed that the French had no word for entrepreneur. I believe this was a canard made up by Shirley Williams, but I've tried to track it down. But it's so believable that it's nice anyway. But there is a Russian word, and it of course features in the name of the KGB, and that word is the principal word. Not Russian is full of synonyms, but it's the principal word used for safety in Russia and security, and it's bezopasnost. And it's a negative word. Bez means without, and pasnost means danger. And so the word for safety in Russia is a negative word. The default position of life and history in Russia is danger, and this is not surprising. My favorite street in Moscow is in the south of the city. It's called Ulica Bolshaya Ordenka. It contains a lovely church called the Consolation of All Sorrows. But it's called Bolshaya Ordenka. It's the street of the Great Horde, because it's where the Great Horde used to turn up every 5 years to collect their tribute. Russia is a frontier country, Moscow a frontier city. It's been invaded repeatedly over and over again, and it has no natural defences. We, surrounded as we are by deep salt sea, are inclined to lecture countries which don't have that protection on the way that they behave about, say, who controls Ukraine and how far foreign troops can get from St. Petersburg or Voronezh. There are now NATO troops, I think, within 85 miles of St. Petersburg in Narva. And that's about as close as Coventry is to London. I don't think we tolerate that for a moment, if in our case. And it is this problem, this absence of safety, this permanent position of fearing invasion, of being invaded, repeated by the Germans, by the French, by the Germans, by the Poles, whoever it is, there's always somebody. It makes you behave differently, and it makes it very difficult for you to be a stable, free country. The joke about Prussia was that it was not a country with an army, but an army with a country. And the problem with Russia is, similarly, it's not a country with a police state. It's a police state with a country, and it's likely always to be, as long as it's threatened by its neighbours. And we are just going to have to put up with that. And it would be wise to recognise it. And the best way of bringing it to an end would be to stop invading Russia. But whether we can persuade anybody to do that, I'm not sure.
We have time for a couple of more last questions.
Yeah, yes, please.
I would agree with you on the comparison between Turkey and Russia. Another point of comparison is, for instance, Chechnya and the Kurds. You could find a lot of parallels in the case law, for instance, of the European Court of Human Rights, and basically the same words represented the minority groups in both types of cases. And my question would be, why do you think the level of danger to oppositionists and journalists is different in those two current political regimes?
I think the difference between, another point about Turkey, by the way, is that if you go to the most militantly Islamic suburb of Istanbul, you find a building which is the headquarters of a Chechen separatist group. So it goes even further. The difference is that Turkey, though it never attained the level of that one might have hoped of being a free, pluralist, democratic country on the lines of a Western European country, it got much closer to it, much closer to having a genuine civil society, and it certainly had a very, very powerful free press before Mr. Erdogan began to get hold of it. And he has a lot more to destroy if he's ever to achieve the sort of supreme despotic power which it seems to me that he wants. And so, whereas in Russia the development of civil society never really got to anything like the level that it reached in Turkey. This is partly because of the grave mistake made by the West after the fall of the Soviet regime to prescribe to Russia cold shower, Hayek-style capitalism and democracy without any attempt to create the rule of law. And what Russia needs above all things is the establishment of the rule of law. And that is something which we could have concentrated on. What we did instead was discredit the idea of democracy, fail to build a civil society, or indeed to do anything which would in the long term undermine the corruption which was inherited. People go on about Russian corruption. It was inherited entirely from the Soviet system. Which was deeply corrupt, institutionally corrupt from top to bottom. You could do nothing of any importance in Soviet Moscow without bribing people. And that was the low level of being a resident Western correspondent. It went far further and far higher than the rest of it. And of course the party, when it collapsed, handed over all these assets to other people, which were the basis of new corruption. But I think the fundamental reason for the difference is that Turkey was developing a much stronger civil society than Russia has ever had. And so Erdogan needs to be far more ruthless and despotic if he's to achieve his aim. I think he'll be the last.
Yeah, just to go back to your original point that the West wants to see Russia as something different, do you, just to flip that on its head, do you almost believe that Russia kind of wants that, maybe for reasons of internal stability, but it seems to me that there have been several opportunities, at least in foreign policy, things like Syria and North Korea, that the West has almost given out like an olive branch for Russia to sort of join in, but it's sort of thrown back in their face a bit.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I don't think Russia really has much leverage in North Korea anymore, for instance. And that could be the simpler reason for it not playing the part. And obviously, having a reputation for being rough and tough in a bad neighbourhood is no bad thing to have. You're not going to say, well, actually, no, I'm really very nice, because that'll only get you kicked and punched more. And they do go on quite a lot about their unusable nuclear weapons, as people will. But nuclear weapons are unusable, and they don't really make any real difference to the true balance of power. But in general, perhaps there may be a temptation to let people believe the worst sometimes. But it's if it leads to the build-up of hostile military forces on Russia's borders and the building of these missile shields and all the other things which are aggressive military actions, then I can't think it would have been worthwhile. I think basically the creation by Russia of an increasingly convincing-looking conventional military posture has been a response to actions by the West, not a deliberate attempt to make itself more feared. I think of that. I will go on.
Sorry. Who do you think will come to power after Putin in Russia? Who do you think will come to power after Putin in Russia? Sorry.
Honestly, I have no idea. I fear, above all things, I fear chaos. I think that when you have a very strong and effective state and it ends that the danger of a time of troubles is always strongest at these moments, and those who continue to wish to destabilize Russia with people power, color revolutions, and all the rest of it, will see the departure of Vladimir Putin, whatever shape it takes, as an opportunity. I think it could be very bad time.
What do you think the West could do to help Russia if it would want to?
Who doesn't want to, I think, has to be.
If they ever wanted
Be
to.
nice.
What do you think they should do if they ever wanted to, or could do?
Oh, if they wanted to, I can't tell you the state of euphoria which I found myself in at the end of the Cold War, and I think many other people, that at last this awful menace was over. I can't tell you how disappointed I was when I realised how completely the opportunity had been wasted. But I don't know whether the opportunity is there anymore. Who could now go, if someone decided they were going to offer a martial aid plan to Russia, which I have to say it badly needs, who has the money, who could go, who would accept it? The time has gone. It would be good, though. Martial aid and the rule of law, that's what's needed. And for that, the end of this silly bogeyman policy would be, I think, a prerequisite as well. Let us hope. Stranger, more surprising things have happened. We could have sat here 3 years before the collapse of Soviet power and not known it was going to happen. So it is possible for good surprises to take place, but I see no sign of it. And I am, by nature, a pessimist, so I'm not.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much.